Once upon a time, before Israel had a king, before the days of mighty warriors like Saul and David, there was a man who carried the weight of a nation on his weary shoulders. His name was Eli, the high priest of Israel, and for many years he had been the voice of wisdom, the keeper of God's law, the one who stood between the people and their Creator. But now, as he sat at the entrance of the temple in Shiloh, his sight growing dim and his body bent with age, he could feel the weight of regret pressing heavier than the robes on his back. He had been strong once. He had been a young priest full of passion, ready to serve the Lord with unwavering devotion. He had offered sacrifices at the great altar, watched over the holy ark of the covenant, and led the people in worship. He had done everything he was supposed to do, but now his greatest fears had come to pass. His sons, Hophni and Phinehas, the ones who were supposed to carry on the priesthood, had become corrupt beyond measure. They had stolen from the offerings, taken more than was allowed, and treated the sacrifices with disrespect and greed. Eli heard the rumors, how his sons took the best portions of the sacrifices for themselves, how they seduced the women who served at the temple, how they used their positions not to serve the Lord, but to serve their own greed and desires. They had dishonored the Lord, and Eli, he had let them. He had warned them, yes. He had told them that their actions were evil, that they made the Lord's people despise the temple, but he had never stopped them. And for that, he knew judgment was coming. One day, years before the weight of his sorrow had fully set in, a woman had appeared at the temple steps, weeping so desperately that Eli had mistaken her for a drunkard. "How long will you keep drinking?" he had rebuked her. "Put away your wine." But the woman had looked up at him with tear-streaked cheeks, her lips trembling. "No, my lord," she had whispered, "I have not been drinking wine. I am a woman in great distress. I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord." Eli had felt a strange stirring in his chest. "What is it you ask for?" he had asked. The woman had wiped her face, steadied herself, and answered with quiet, desperate faith, "A son." And without knowing why, Eli had spoken words that would change his life forever. "Go in peace. May the Lord grant you what you have asked." And the woman, her name was Hannah, had left with hope in her eyes. A year later, Hannah had returned, but this time she was not empty-handed. A small child clung to the folds of her robe, a little boy with dark curls and wide, wondering eyes. "His name is Samuel," she had said, her voice both joyful and sorrowful. "And as I vowed to the Lord, I give him back to him to serve all the days of his life." And so Eli had taken the boy in, Samuel, who had been an answer to prayer. Samuel, who had been dedicated before he even took his first steps. Samuel, who would become like a son to Eli, more of a son than his own had ever been. Raising Samuel in the temple had given Eli hope again. The boy was obedient, eager to serve, full of curiosity and reverence for the Lord. Unlike Hophni and Phinehas, Samuel never questioned the holiness of the temple, never sought to take what was not his, never treated the Lord's house as a place for personal gain. Eli had watched as he grew from a small child into a young man, his hands growing stronger as he carried out his duties, his mind growing sharper as he learned the scriptures. And in Samuel, Eli saw something he had long believed was lost in Israel: hope. But even as Samuel flourished, Hophni and Phinehas continued down their wicked path. Eli knew he was losing them. And one day, the Lord sent a messenger to tell him what he had feared for years. A man of God had come to him. his eyes dark with warning, his voice heavy with judgment. Because you have honored your sons more than you have honored the Lord, because you have let them continue in their sin, the house of Eli will fall. Your sons will both die on the same day, and the Lord will raise up a faithful priest in your place. Eli had listened, and though his heart broke, he knew it was true. He had tried to guide them, but he had not stopped them. And now it was too late. That evening, Eli sat with Samuel near the temple's entrance, watching the last golden light of the day fade into the darkness. "Master Eli," Samuel said softly, his voice filled with curiosity, "do you think the Lord still speaks to men like he did to Moses?" Eli glanced at the boy, his heart aching. "I do not know, my son," he answered, "but if he ever does, you must be ready to listen." Samuel nodded, his young face filled with wonder. And deep down, Eli knew Samuel would hear the Lord's voice long before he ever would again. Because his time was ending, but Samuel's had only just begun. The night was deep and still. The only sounds in the temple, the distant crackling of the sacred lamps and the rhythmic breathing of the young boy who slept nearby. Eli, lying on his own mat, shifted uncomfortably. His body was heavy with age, his limbs stiff from years of kneeling before the altar, his vision too dim to see much beyond shadows. But tonight, something felt different. Eli had lived through many seasons, had served in the Lord's house for longer than most could remember, yet the Lord had been silent for years. The days of great signs and mighty words had faded into distant memory, and Eli had long since accepted that God no longer spoke as he once had. But then, a voice broke the silence. "Samuel." Eli stirred, his old heart startled. A rustling sound followed as the young boy sat up, his small footsteps padding across the stone floor. "Master Eli?" Samuel's voice was uncertain. "You called me?" Eli rubbed his tired eyes. "No, my son," he murmured. "Go back to sleep." Samuel hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. Eli sighed, adjusting his position. Perhaps it had been a dream. But then it happened again. "Samuel!" The boy came running once more. "Here I am! You called me!" Eli sat up straighter, his brows furrowing. He had not called. "Go back to bed, Samuel," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Samuel obeyed, but Eli could feel the air thickening with something unseen, something that sent a shiver through his aged bones. And then, a third time. "Samuel!" The child ran to him, breathless now. "Master, I heard you call me." And in that moment, Eli understood. It had been so long since the Lord had spoken, so long since his voice had been heard in Israel. But now, God was calling Samuel. His heart clenched, a mixture of awe and sorrow filling his chest. It had not been Eli whom the Lord had chosen. It had not been his sons. It was Samuel. "Go back, my son," Eli said softly, his voice thick with something unspoken. "And the next time you hear the voice, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" Samuel nodded, his young face serious, his heart open in a way Eli's had not been in years. And as the boy returned to his mat, Eli sat in the darkness, listening to the silence, knowing that the Lord had turned to another. The next morning, Samuel did not come to him. Eli did not call for him either, because he already knew. When Samuel finally emerged from his chamber, his face was pale, his hands trembling, his eyes wide with something Eli recognized all too well, fear of the truth. "Samuel," Eli said, his voice weary but firm, "come to me, my son." The boy hesitated, then stepped forward. "Tell me what the Lord said to you. Do not hide anything from me." Samuel opened his mouth, then closed it again. His small hands curled into fists at his sides, his young face filled with struggle. Eli exhaled slowly. "Do not fear, Samuel. Whatever the Lord has spoken, I must hear it." Samuel swallowed hard. Then, in a quiet, breaking voice, he spoke. "The Lord says, He will bring judgment upon your house, that your sons will die on the same day, that your family will no longer serve as priests." Eli felt the words strike deep into his chest, though he had known them before they were spoken. He had already received this warning. Now the Lord had confirmed it, and he had chosen Samuel to carry his voice instead of him. For a long moment, Eli said nothing. He simply stared past Samuel, past the temple walls, past the years of his life, into the truth he could no longer escape. Then, at last, he nodded. "He is the Lord," he whispered. "Let him do what is right in his eyes." Samuel stood there, as if waiting for something, for anger, for sorrow, for protest. But Eli had none of those things left to give. He had lived too long, seen too much, and his fate was already sealed. Days turned to weeks, and the whispers in Shiloh grew. People spoke of Samuel now. The boy who hears from the Lord, a prophet in the temple. Eli's time is ending. Eli did not argue. He watched from a distance as Samuel continued to grow, as his presence in the temple became more than that of a servant. He was becoming a leader, a voice. And Eli, though he still sat in the place of authority, knew that he was already fading into the background. The Lord had left him. And now he waited for the day when his house would fall completely, because his sons were still walking toward their own destruction. And soon, the day of reckoning would come. The temple of Shiloh was not as it once had been. Once, the people had approached its gates with reverence, their eyes lifted toward heaven, their offerings brought with trembling hands. But now, Eli heard whispers of discontent, of doubt, of corruption. And the worst of it? The whispers were true. Eli sat heavily on his stool near the temple entrance, his body weary, his heart heavier still. The heat of the day clung to him, and the sound of murmuring voices drifted from the outer courts. The priests steal from the sacrifices. They take the best for themselves before the fat is even burned for the Lord. Hophni and Phinehas, they do not fear God. Eli closed his eyes, swallowing the bitterness that rose in his throat. He had known for years that his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were wicked men. They had been raised in the temple, meant to be set apart for the Lord's service, but rather than humbling themselves before the Most High, they had twisted their power into something vile. He had heard stories of how they demanded the best portions of meat from the sacrifices, food meant to be burned in offering to the Lord. "Give us the meat now," they had said, their voices filled with arrogance. "We will not take boiled meat, but raw, so we may roast it as we please." And when the people had protested, insisting that the fat must first be burned as an offering to God, Hophni had laughed, and Phinehas had threatened them. "If you will not give it willingly," they had said, "then we will take it by force." Eli's hands clenched into fists on his lap. And that was not even the worst of it. He had also heard the rumors of the women, the young servants at the entrance of the tent of meeting, how his sons had defiled them in the very place that was meant to be holy. Eli's stomach churned. "They have no shame," he murmured to himself. And yet, what had he done to stop them? Had he not rebuked them? Had he not pleaded with them? "Why do you do such things?" he had asked them, his voice shaking, his heart breaking. "I hear from all the people about your wickedness. My sons, this is not good. You make the Lord's people sin." But they had not listened. They had mocked his warnings, dismissed his rebukes, continued in their wickedness as if judgment would never come. And Eli, for all his sorrow, for all his regret, had let them. He had not stripped them of their priestly robes. He had not cast them from the temple, and now the Lord's patience was running thin. One evening, as Eli sat at the entrance of the temple, he heard footsteps approach. Not the light, eager steps of Samuel, but something heavier, something deliberate. A stranger stood before him, a man wrapped in a cloak, his face shadowed in the dim firelight. Eli sat up, squinting through his failing vision. "Who are you?" he asked. The man did not introduce himself. Instead, his voice thundered like judgment itself. "Thus says the Lord, did I not choose your house to be priests? Did I not set you apart to serve at my altar, to offer sacrifices, to wear the ephod in my presence?" Eli's breath caught in his throat. This was not a man speaking. This was a message from God. "But you have honored your sons above me," the voice continued, sharp as a blade, cutting straight through him. Eli sank back onto his stool, his chest tight, his hands trembling. "Therefore," the man declared, "the days are coming when I will cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house. Your sons will die on the same day, and I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, one who will do what is in my heart and my mind." Eli could not breathe. His worst fears, his deepest regrets, the warnings he had ignored, were now coming to pass. He knew the Lord's voice. And this was not an idle warning. This was a sentence. Eli bowed his head. "He is the Lord," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Let him do what is right in his eyes." The man turned and left, his footsteps fading into the night. And Eli was left alone with the weight of judgment upon him. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Eli watched Samuel move through the temple, tending to his duties, carrying himself with the quiet obedience that had always set him apart. And in Samuel, Eli saw the truth he had been blind to for too long. Samuel was the one God would raise up, not Hophni, not Phinehas. Samuel, the boy he had taken in as a child, the one given to the Lord by Hannah's weeping prayers, the boy who now moved with a quiet confidence that Eli's own sons had never possessed. Eli knew the time would come when Samuel would replace him. And though his heart ached for what he had lost, for what he had failed to do, he could not fight against the will of God because the Lord had already chosen. And Eli was only waiting for the day when the judgment would come. But before it did, he would witness the moment Samuel was called. The night when the boy would hear the Lord's voice for the first time, and Eli would tell him to listen. Because though Eli had failed, though he had been blind, Samuel would not be, and that would be the beginning of something new. The night hung thick over Shiloh, the only light in the temple coming from the sacred lamp, its flickering glow casting long shadows on the stone walls. The silence was deep, broken only by the distant rustling of the curtains and the soft breathing of a young boy asleep near the Ark of the Covenant. Eli lay in his chamber, his body heavy, his breath slow. He had spent years listening for the Lord, but it had been a long time since he had spoken. And Eli feared he would never speak again. But tonight was different. Somewhere in the stillness of the temple, a voice whispered, "Samuel." The boy stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Here I am," Samuel called, his voice groggy with sleep. He scrambled to his feet, bare toes padding softly across the stone floor as he hurried toward Eli's chamber. "Master Eli, you called me?" Eli shifted, forcing himself upright, his old hands gripping the edges of his robe. "No, my son," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "I did not call you. Go back and lie down." Samuel hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. Eli exhaled slowly. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps he had only imagined it. But then it happened again. "Samuel." The boy sat up immediately, his heart pounding. He ran to Eli's side once more. "Here I am! You called me!" Eli blinked, his mind stirring with something he had not felt in a long time. This was no ordinary voice. This was something else. "Go back, my son," he said softly, though his heart had begun to race. "Lie down again." Samuel, confused, did as he was told. But the moment he settled onto his mat, the voice came a third time. "Samuel!" The boy ran once more to Eli's chamber, his breath quick, his voice tinged with worry. "Master, here I am. You called me." And then Eli understood. It was the Lord. After years of silence, after generations of corruption in the temple, God was speaking again, but not to Eli, not to the high priest, to Samuel. Eli swallowed hard, the truth pressing against his chest like a great weight. Samuel, the boy Eli had raised, the boy given to the temple in faith, the boy whose hands had never defiled an offering, whose heart had never turned from the Lord, he was the one God had chosen to speak to. Not Hophni, not Phinehas, not Eli. The Lord had moved on from him, but still, Eli would not stand in the way of the boy's calling. With slow, trembling hands, he reached for Samuel's arm. "Go, my son," he said, his voice rough but certain. "Lie down again, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" Samuel nodded, his small face filled with something Eli had long forgotten: expectation. And as the boy disappeared into the shadows, Eli sat in the dim light, his chest rising and falling, his heart filled with both sorrow and hope. Because though Eli's time was ending, Samuel's had just begun. The next morning, Samuel did not come to him. Eli did not call for him either, because he already knew. When the boy finally approached, his face was pale, his hands wringing the edge of his robe. "Samuel," Eli said, his voice gentle but firm, "tell me what the Lord said to you. Do not hide it from me." Samuel hesitated, his young face full of conflict. Eli saw the same fear in his eyes that he had once felt himself, the weight of carrying the Lord's words. "Do not fear, my son," Eli pressed. "Tell me everything." Samuel took a breath. "The Lord says, He will bring judgment upon your house, that your sons will die on the same day. that your family will no longer serve as priests." Eli sat in silence. The words cut deep, but they were no surprise. He had known. He had known for years, and now it was sealed. At last, he nodded. "He is the Lord," he whispered. "Let him do what is right in his eyes." Samuel stood there, his small hands gripping his robe as if waiting for something, for anger, for grief, for Eli to cry out against the judgment. But Eli had no fight left. His fate was already set, and all that was left to do was wait for the day it would come to pass. In the weeks that followed, Samuel continued to grow, and Eli continued to fade into the background. The people began to speak of Samuel as the new prophet, whispering that he heard from the Lord, that his words carried power. Eli did not argue. He watched from a distance as Samuel walked through the temple, tending to his duties with quiet strength. And in Samuel, Eli saw the boy he had always wished his sons would be. Hophni and Phinehas had been given every chance to serve the Lord, and they had chosen corruption. Samuel, given to the temple as a child, had chosen faithfulness instead. Eli could not change the past, but he could teach Samuel what he had failed to teach his own sons. He would guide him for as long as he had breath, because soon the Lord's judgment would fall. And when it did, Samuel would be the one to lead Israel. To be continued in Part 5. The city of Shiloh was in mourning. The news of Israel's devastating defeat had spread like wildfire, and with it came the shock of 3 great losses. Hophni and Phinehas were dead, Eli had fallen, and worst of all, the Ark of the Covenant had been taken. The people wailed in the streets, tearing their garments, pouring dust over their heads in anguish. The Ark, the very presence of God, was gone. For the first time in generations, Israel was left without a priest, without a leader, without the Lord's protection, and it all had come to pass just as the Lord had foretold. Eli lay in his chamber, his breathing ragged, his body weak from the fall. His neck had broken, and with it, the last of his strength had left him. He could feel his spirit hovering between life and death, between this world and the next. He had not died instantly. No, the Lord had given him just a little more time, and in that time, his mind raced through the years, through his failures, through his regrets, through the choices that had led him here. He had been a young man once, full of zeal, eager to serve the Lord. He had worn the priestly robes with pride, believing that his house would forever stand in the service of God. But he had been blind. Blind to the sins of his sons, blind to the whispers of corruption, blind to the warnings the Lord had sent him time and time again. And now, everything had come crashing down. His family was dead. His priesthood was ended. The ark was gone. And yet, Eli did not fear, because though his house had fallen, he knew that Samuel would rise. Meanwhile, across the city, a woman lay in labor. She was the wife of Phinehas, and when she had heard the news of her husband's death, she had been overcome with grief. Her body had gone into labor far too soon, the weight of sorrow pressing her into the dust as midwives gathered around her. "Breathe!" they urged her. "You must push!" She could barely hear them. The only thing that filled her ears was the echo of what had been lost. The ark, gone. Her husband, dead. Her father-in-law, gone. The priesthood, shattered. She cried out in agony, her body racked with pain, her soul hollow with sorrow, and as the baby was placed into her arms, she did not smile. She did not rejoice. She only spoke one word, Ichabod, a name that meant the glory has departed from Israel. And then, with one last breath, she was gone. The midwives wept, clutching the newborn child, because her words were true. The glory had departed. Israel had fallen into darkness, and no one knew if the Lord would ever return to them again. But across the temple, as the torches burned low and the sacred lamp flickered in the quiet night, Samuel knelt before the altar. He was alone now. The priest who had raised him was gone. The temple that had once been full was now empty, and yet Samuel did not feel abandoned, because the Lord had not left him. He had spoken to Samuel before, and Samuel knew he would speak again. And when he did, Samuel would be ready. Because though Eli's house had fallen, God was not finished with Israel. The old priest had fallen, but the young prophet had risen. And Samuel would lead Israel into a new chapter, one where kings would rise and fall, where giants would be slain, where the Lord would restore what had been lost. But for now, he waited, because the story was far from over. The temple of Shiloh stood eerily silent in the days following Eli's death, where once the halls had been filled with the voices of priests and the murmurs of worshippers, now only whispers of grief and uncertainty remained. The people wandered through the city in a daze, lost without the ark, without leadership, without hope. Eli had fallen, his sons were dead, and Israel stood on the brink of despair. But the Lord was not finished with his people. Samuel stood alone in the temple, the sacred lamp casting long shadows across the cold stone. The weight of Eli's absence settled on his shoulders. He had never known the temple without Eli. The old priest had been a father to him, a guide, the only authority he had ever served under. And now, Samuel was the last one left. He knelt before the altar, his hands pressed together, his head bowed. "Lord," he whispered, his voice trembling, "what will you have me do?" For days, the people had come to him, seeking answers, seeking comfort. But what could he give them? The ark was gone. The priests were dead. Israel was leaderless. And Samuel, he was just a boy. Or at least he had been. Because now, whether he was ready or not, he had to stand. Because Israel had no one else. Days turned to weeks, and the rumors spread far beyond Shiloh. The Philistines had taken the ark, but they had not found victory. Their great temple of Dagon had collapsed before it. Plagues had struck their cities. Sickness had ravaged their people, and soon they feared the ark more than they had ever feared Israel's army. "Send it back," the Philistine rulers commanded. "Let us not keep what does not belong to us." And so the ark was returned, sent back on a cart, led by 2 oxen who knew the way better than any man. When the people of Israel saw it rolling into their land, they wept with joy. But Samuel did not rejoice, because he knew the ark had returned. But the presence of God was not in the ark alone. Israel still had not turned back to the Lord, and until they did, no golden chest would save them. One evening, Samuel stood before the gathered elders of Israel, his young frame no longer small, his voice no longer uncertain. "If you are truly returning to the Lord," he declared, "then put away your idols. Serve him only, and he will deliver you from the Philistines." The elders nodded solemnly. They had seen what happened when they trusted in relics instead of God Himself. Now they had no choice but to return to the Lord with their whole hearts. And so, for the first time in many years, Israel repented. The people gathered at Mizpah, weeping before the Lord, turning from their wickedness, seeking Him again. And when the Philistines saw them gathered, they marched to destroy them. But this time, things were different. This time, Israel did not place their faith in a wooden ark. This time, they placed their faith in the Lord. Samuel stood before them, offering a sacrifice, lifting his hands to the heavens. "Lord, save your people." And then thunder shook the sky. A mighty roar split the heavens, and the Philistine army was thrown into chaos. They turned on one another. They fled in terror. And Israel chased them down, striking them until victory was theirs. For the first time since Eli's death, since the ark had been lost, since darkness had seemed to overtake them, Israel stood victorious. And Samuel stood as their leader. Years passed, and the name of Samuel spread throughout Israel. He became a prophet, a judge, a man who led his people back to God. And though Eli had fallen, Samuel carried on his legacy in a way that Hophni and Phinehas never could. He led with righteousness, with humility, with wisdom. And when the people demanded a king, it was Samuel who anointed Saul. And later, when Saul failed, it was Samuel who anointed David, the man after God's own heart. But he never forgot Eli. Because though the old priest had been weak, though he had failed his sons, he had guided Samuel when he was just a child. He had taught him to listen for the Lord, and that alone had changed Israel's future. The priesthood of Eli was gone, but Samuel's calling, Samuel's legacy, had just begun, and the Lord was still with his people.